we're just continuing to fill in some dots here. Nothing new. We're still not working with the model. Still just bridging the gap between the paper and the top layers of the chalk. Unfortunately, I think the camera got a little out of focus for this small snippet of video. But I think, luckily, before we get into the actual work with the model again, we get it refocused here. So now I'm just bouncing up to the shoulder. Again, just filling in some dots, smoothing it out a little bit.
Are you thinking about anything specific while you're doing this, or are you able to just go kind of autopilot?
This is pretty much autopilot. It's just as long as I'm every once in a while checking in to make sure I'm not making my marks too hard. I'm just listening to music and filling in dots. Nothing else much is going on in my head. But it's kind of nice though. Every once in a while, I'll start to think about like what I'm going to plan on doing next in the drawing, for example, and I'll start to kind of get excited because at this stage too, things are starting to get really smooth and nice, and the value relationships are already kind of being established. So I'm starting to get really excited about the next time I'm going to be sitting with the model because I know I'll be able to finish this out and have it look pretty strong. Earlier on, sort of in my career, when I would get at a stage like this in the drawing, my mind would start to wander to, how great this drawing is coming out. I'm like, yeah, this is right on the right track. This is going to be the drawing that's going to launch my career, and everybody's going to remember this one for sure. And you have those dreams of glory and riches, and it never really works out like that. It's that romantic dream of the artist, But it's nice to think that people are going to remember this drawing and it's going to make a difference and whatnot. But eventually, you realize that they're all just stepping stones to your next big work or next drawing you do. And hopefully, in the end, we just leave a trail of nice drawings and paintings in our wake. As my education sort of expanded and my knowledge of other working artists grew and my awareness of other working artists grew, I began to realize that there are just so many phenomenal artists, and not just in the U.S., but all over the world. We're definitely in a global environment here when it comes to art, and not just in how everybody's working now at such high levels of quality, but we're able to share ideas and communicate and go to school in Florence and talk to painters in England and Australia and even China and Russia. And it's so amazing and kind of humbling to realize that there's people all over the world who are just whittling hours away, doing this very stuff and trying to propel their skill forward. And just among the sea of great artists, and hopefully, hopefully we end up producing something that collectively adds to our goal. My original intent when I had wanted to be an artist a long time ago, and this was before I actually started painting, but before when I was like just out of high school, and I had dreams of studying the old masters and learning what they were doing and bringing the secrets of the old masters and the quality of work of the old masters back to art. Because this was before I knew about Richard Schmid or Jeremy Lipking or Jacob Collins or any of these guys who are already doing these amazing works of such high technical quality. I was one of those students who was in a high school situation where the teacher didn't know about any contemporary artists really. The last I would say, realistic artist my high school teacher knew about was Norman Rockwell. And it was pretty much the impression everybody had that, after Norman Rockwell died, there was no more people who could do realistic paintings kind of thing. And you have to look at the old masters, and nobody knows how they did any of that stuff. And so there's always that mysticism. So I wanted to be the savior of painting. That was my dream, my romantic dream with painting originally was to save it. And I was, I was so excited about it. And, I think back to some of the conversations I had about this to other people, and it's so foolish to me now because in all honesty, most of those people probably knew about some contemporary artists, at least more than me. And at the time I had started working at the hospital, and so I'd been at the hospital for a while. So I was around doctors all the time. I worked with them. They were 5 feet away from me when I was working. I talked to them all the time. We were great friends, and these were probably folks who bought paintings from galleries, nice paintings. And
what was the timeline of that then? So it was after high school, or the end of high school, that you kind of had this realization that you wanted to, save the art world or whatever. So 18 years old, and then you start. How did the hospital thing happen?
Oh, it was just a random series of
thing?
unfortunate events. Yeah, it was. I had left. After I left high school, I didn't really do much. I was offered a scholarship to the Arizona universities, but I wasn't really impressed with any of their arts programs, so I decided not to do that. And I instead went to the community colleges to just practice or to do my prereqs while I figured out kind of what I wanted to do. Because at that time, I was still under the impression that you couldn't be an artist. You could learn enough to teach art at a university or high school, but you couldn't live selling art. And so I had gone to classes at the community college for a few months, and most of them were art classes, and I just kept dropping out of them because I was just so unsatisfied. I'd go in and, my natural abilities, we could say, were as high already as, or a little bit higher than some of the other students who were starting out there. And so I kind of felt like, well, there's not really much to learn, which I think a lot of us feel like when we go to some of these community college or university classes where you're not really learning the technical aspect. So I had dropped out of school at community college and decided I wanted to go into animation because it seemed like traditional drawing animation would be the the best way for me to get to draw all the time, which is what I liked doing. And I went there for about a year, and it was great when we were drawing. We did cell animation. We actually drew from the figure once or twice a week. I loved the idea of making, doing drawings of, even cartoons or cartoony people and making them come alive when we shot them. And it was fantastic. And then we switched to computers because very few companies are still doing traditional animation. It's a very rare thing. The majority of it is computer work. And so I got to the point where I was sitting at a computer all day long. And I hated it. It was not interesting to me at all. I wanted to be up and moving and walking around, and I wanted to draw, and I wanted to actually do art. And so I ended up leaving animation school, and I didn't continue with it. At that point, I wasn't really sure what to do. I had a job at a bank as a telephone banker, and my friend worked at the hospital and said it was a pretty good gig, so I got a job at the hospital, and I was working in the ER, and it was fun. And I was still doing art on the side, like just my own acrylic paintings or drawings here and there. Yeah, this is in Arizona. Probably 2004, 2006 maybe or so. And so we're talking a few years, like 3 years after I graduated high school at this point. And so I actually started to really enjoy the problem-solving aspect of the ER doctors at the hospital I worked at. It was really interesting to me that patients would come in, they were given a set of problems, and they'd have to think about it or talk to other doctors and then determine what was going on. And, ER doctors actually have are some of the best diagnosticians because they see so much stuff, and they're really good with the problem solving. They're not like some other doctors may be, where you come in with some problems and say, okay, we'll try this drug and we'll see if it works. You know, ER doctors are trying to actually figure out more of the root cause before starting to randomly prescribe medication. And that really appealed to me. And I also was attracted to the aspect of, you know, being able to heal people. You know, that's really cool to me. So I started on that path, and I was doing my prereqs so that I could apply to med school back in college. And so that's kind of where I was at the hospital. But I was still working and painting on the side. And my intent then was, I was thinking, maybe I will, instead of being a doctor, maybe I'll be a PA, or maybe even like a traveling nurse or something like that, and go to third world countries and help them out. And then on the side, I'm going to paint. And as I paint, I'm going to be the savior of painting, because I can't make money selling painting. Nobody makes money selling paintings. So I'm going to do medicine, and then I'm going to and then I'm going to do my paintings on the side, and I'll save painting that way. And so I did a few like local little shows and whatever.
What were you painting during this time?
Everything.
Anything.
But not really anything observational.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So every once in a while I could draw from a photograph. You know, I learned enough in high school that you could like grid something out, and you could just copy the lights and darks as you see. You know, I didn't have any of the terminology, but I knew that if you copy the lights and darks and you use a grid, then you can probably get something that's pretty close. And so, you know, I had a few commission works. One of the doctors commissioned me to do a drawing of her cabin that she had, that she gave me a photo of. And one of the other doctors commissioned me to do a painting of his dog. And then I did like abstract paintings and...
No, you didn't.
Oh yeah, lots of abstract paintings. And I got into this like, the 3-panel paintings at a skewed angle, all hung together with an abstract design flowing through them. I did all of that sort of stuff. You know, looking at artists of the past that were a little more eccentric and crazy, like Salvador Dali, who says that, you know, every artist needs a healthy dose of megalomania. You know, I was thinking, oh, I got to have this pseudonym and sign it this way and have this whole personality associated with my artwork. So I was kind of doing that for a while. And then it all changed when I was in a bookstore, and I just happened to pass by a magazine rack that had a magazine out by American artists who had been out for a while. I just not been aware of it. And this magazine was a special issue, I think it was called Masters of Realism. And in that, it had Daniel Graves and Jeremy Lipke. It had a little Richard Schmidt. I think it had some Lipke paintings in it as well. And I opened this magazine up, and it was like a completely life-changing thing. It was like, what? There's people that are doing this? How did nobody tell? How could I have gone my whole life without ever knowing or having anybody tell me that somebody could paint like this and draw like this? And I'm wasting all my time trying to figure out and reinvent the wheel when everybody's already operating at this high skill level. And to boot, they're selling paintings and making a living as an artist. And so that to me was pretty revealing. And I decided at that point that there were enough doctors in the world. And, you know, not that doctors are bad or being a doctor is bad. It's great. We need doctors for sure. But I was also getting to the point, it kind of coincided with this thing where the hospital was undergoing budget cuts. And so we had staff cuts in the ER, and the doctor's hands continually more and more started to get tied by insurance. You know, they couldn't give the patient the treatment that they wanted because of the insurance. So they come back to their desk and they're swearing and cursing. And it's like, what's the deal? It's like, well, they have this stupid insurance, and I can't do this to the patient that I think we need to do. And it became really disheartening and frustrating to me. And you know, if I was going to be a doctor and I knew the answer on how to solve somebody and I couldn't do it because some insurance company didn't want to pay it, it was really upsetting. And I didn't want to have to deal with that. And, I saw the frustration that they were having. So at that point, I decided that I was going to commit my efforts and learn how to paint. And so that was, I think, December of 2008 and to January of 2009. That's when I started oil painting. Just looking at that magazine and trying to do paintings that were kind of like that. And it's interesting to look back now and see how bad they were. But I guess for a first shot, you know, they weren't too bad. And then quite quickly after that, I had still been taking like one class a semester in art while I was doing all my other classes. And so I was in a painting class, I think, at the community college. And I enrolled in a workshop here at the Scottsdale Artist School that Jeremy Lipking was teaching. And I was actually on the waiting list, and they called me like a week before, and they said, "Oh, do you want to take it?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, but I need to figure out the money." And so I had to like borrow money to take this workshop. It was because I didn't know how to lay paint down. Oil paint confused me. It was just, it's wet and mushy, and I didn't know how to lay paint on top of paint and how to keep the colors rich and any of that stuff. So Jeremy Lipking was the artist that blew me away first, and I thought was just top notch, and he still is. He's still phenomenal. And so that's who I wanted to take a workshop from. And so it was all of these just sort of events kind of happened and coincided all at the same time to set me on this path. And you know, he came, and I showed up early. I sat right next to him and a little behind him, so I could see every single stroke he made. Because you know, at the time, actually, Jeremy didn't talk a whole lot while he was painting. You know, I'm a jibber jabber. I don't stop until somebody like cuts me off and asks a question, or I have to take a breath. And Jeremy is kind of yeah. Jeremy's kind of different. He really focuses and concentrates, and so that was very enlightening to me as well, as how much thought was going into every single stroke he was doing. And you know, when there was something relevant, he would articulate it, which was good. But also just seeing how he was laying paint down and the choices that he was making was another game changer for me. And that was only you know, 2 months after I had started painting. I saw that, and that one workshop alone propelled me even further. And then the following month, I started showing in a gallery in Phoenix with some paintings I had. And then from there, I had started painting with a group of local painters here, and they told me about Richard Schmidt and the palette and chisel, and they said, "Oh, you should go there. You can paint models every day of the week, and it's all included." And so I basically, a month or two later, I got a job at a hospital in Chicago, and I moved. And
How long were you in Chicago for?
It's about 3 years. Roughly the fall of 2009. So like 9 or 10 months into my painting experiences, to about 2012 in the fall, and that's when I left. And I did a solo show each year there at the Palette and Chisel, which you know, wasn't really for anything except that I wanted to you know, once a year be able to hang up all the nice paintings I did, and you know, recognize and it's a goal. I had a set deadline. It got me familiar with that whole process, the whole process of framing things and displaying things and pricing things. And you know, it's interesting to see how people respond to artwork and that's on the walls and things like that. So it was really good. You know, my first show, surprisingly to me, I sold like 12 or 15 paintings out of, which seemed like kind of a lot. The second show, I only sold a couple, and I think part of it was because of the timing. It happened right during, I can't remember, some event in Chicago where nobody was in town, like everybody was traveling. And then the third year was like my going away. You know, I had decided at that point, earlier that year, I'd won the People's Choice Award at the Palette and Chisel, and I felt that I needed to move somewhere else and expose myself to more artists to further my growth. So my show in 2012 was my sort of farewell show, in which I hung my work with some of my students' work as well. And we did pretty well with that. We sold, I don't know, probably half the paintings, quite a few, and that kind of paid for our moving expenses and setting up a studio and everything in Phoenix, which was great. So 2012 in the fall is when we came back here.
And I think some students might hear, might zoom in to the point when you took a workshop and it catapulted your
yeah.
I mean, you showed in a gallery in the next month. This is atypical.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, it's true.
So I think, well, my question is, at what point, so you were already showing in galleries. I don't know what type of galleries, I don't know what kind of work you were making at the time, but you were doing something with your paintings.
Mm-hmm.
You still decided to pick up and move to Chicago to further your education.
Mm-hmm.
What did you notice about the level of your art at the time, of your abilities? What did you notice that needed to change? And how did you come to the point to realize that, you needed to get back to the basics?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know that there was necessarily any single identifiable thing, except that I could recognize that my paintings, for example, weren't as good as Jeremy Lipking's paintings. So obviously there was more work to be done, and there was never a doubt or a thought in my mind that was something like, oh, well, he's just so beyond good, I'll never get there. It was the thought in my mind was, well, Jeremy is a lot better than me, and a lot of these other guys are a lot better than me, so I need to be doing something different. And I strongly feel that more practice will help.
Mm-hmm.
I needed access to models all the time, and so that was the big drive to move to Chicago, was models every day out of the week. And I like that idea. I like the idea that I could work at the hospital all night long, get off at 7 in the morning, and take a train down to the Palette and Chisel and work all day, and then sleep, and then go back to the hospital. And I could kind of fit the models around my schedule. And so that's why I ended up going out there. We have open studios here at the Scottsdale Artist School, but keep in mind I had very little money. I was sort of gearing my life to be an artist's life. And so I couldn't afford to pay $15 for every open studio. I needed the models to be cheap and available all the time. And I did do the math once. I think it comes out to like 12 cents an hour for models at the Palette and Chisel if you break it down. Here I'm actually working with the model again. So we've zoomed back. You can see I'm now taking a lot more measurements, deciding if the marks I've made were correct. And I'm going back in and trying to advance the shapes of the torso even more, and I'll start to introduce even more value changes. And now I can make more informed decisions, because as we're zoomed back now, we can see how soft and kind of smooth the drawing is starting to look at this point. And so now I can start to do these quarter steps of values, or even finer, to push it even more. It was just a lot of dot filling with the charcoal pencil, a lot of dot filling with the white chalk. But now we're back to the point where things are a little more interesting, and I can start to modify values. So just erasing here, I'm lightly touching with the eraser. Remember, I'm not grinding it in. I'm just sort of lifting off the top layers of chalk there. I don't want to pick up the layers where I filled in the dots. I'm just trying to pick up that top layer. So it's a real light veiling with the eraser here. And as you can see, it's still maintaining a pretty high quality of finish on there while I'm erasing out. I will ultimately have to go back and touch a little bit of it up for the finish, but not too much, because I spent all that time filling in the dots and smoothing things out.
Yeah, I think a lot of students would see that erasing and be like, "What? You just ruined all your dot filling."
Right. Yeah.
But as long as you're being really soft with the eraser, you don't have to worry about that.
Right. Yeah. Your dots will remain filled in.
It'll still be smooth.
Yeah, and it'll still be pretty darn smooth. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, to go back to what we were talking about before, the first gallery I was in, I say something like, oh, after a month, after a workshop, I was in a gallery. It wasn't like a really formal gallery. It was a sort of a pop-up gallery. They have the art walk, so twice a month they hung up paintings, and that was kind of a good fit for me back then, because I didn't have a huge body of work. I knew nothing about framing at the time. Like, I was like, getting framed from Michaels or whatever at the time. And I had no experience dealing with a gallery or dealing with anything at all like that. So it was, and I had no idea how to price my work either. So I was like, oh, I don't know, a couple $100 seems like a huge amount of money for a painting, so that's how much I'll charge. And so I had some good experiences. And then when I was moving to Chicago, I had told the gallery owner, I'm going to be moving across the country, and it's not really going to work for me to be sending paintings back here. I wasn't making a huge amount of money off of a painting, especially since the gallery took 40 or 50% or whatever it was. And so she said, "Oh yeah, I totally understand." And the next day that the gallery was open, the next First Friday day or whatever, she was basically telling everybody that, like, "Oh, he's moving to Chicago. I don't know if he's ever coming back, and he's taking his paintings with him. So if you don't buy them now, you can't buy them." And she sold all of them.
Nice.
I think there might have been one, perhaps, that she didn't sell, but there was like 7 or 8 that she managed to sell, which was fantastic because that paid for me to move to Chicago and get set up over there, which was really fortunate. And then I was in Chicago for about a year, and in 2010 was when I came back to Arizona, and I was painting with some of the guys here that I had been painting with before I left, and they saw my stuff, and they said, "You should be showing in a gallery here. You're just as good as some of the figure painters on Main Street in Scottsdale." And I was like, "Really?" And so the next time I came, a couple months later, I just brought a box of paintings with me. And I had done a lot of research ahead of time. I looked at what the galleries carried, what their work looked like, how much they were selling stuff for, how good were their sales. If I could, I'd contact the artist and ask if the artist was getting paid. A lot of this stuff. I did my research on the galleries, and I had, I think, 3 or 4 galleries. There were 3 that I was going to approach. One which was way lofty goals, 2 that seemed reasonable, and then one that was like my fail-safe school. It's like applying for college.
Yeah, I know. It's
and I didn't start with the super, super lofty one. I think I was still a little intimidated. That was Legacy Gallery. You know,
Nice.
Legacy is a good gallery, but I've been painting for a year. Remember,
Yeah.
to go into Legacy Gallery with all these paintings that are, you know, $50,000, $100,000,
Sure.
and amazing painters who've established careers, and saying, "Oh, look at my little sketches I've done at the Palette and Chisel. Do you want to sell them?" It was a little intimidating. So I went to the first gallery, and I showed them some paintings, and the guy who was there said, "Oh, these look pretty nice. I bet we could probably do something with these, but let me call the owner and have him come over and take a look, and you can go ahead and take a walk, and just leave me these couple paintings so I can show him, and come back in like 15 minutes." And so I took my box, and then I went to the second gallery that I was shooting for, and I showed them the paintings, and she said, "Oh yeah, I think I could sell these. It looks kind of similar to this other artist that I paint with, but it's different enough." And it was funny because the other artist she had mentioned was the guy I was painting with here.
Wow.
The other artist that she was saying my work looked like.
Huh.
Which, you know, in retrospect, I don't think they really look that similar, but it is interesting that she noted that. So she said, "Okay, well, I think we can at least take you on and show one of your paintings for maybe a holiday sale and see how it goes. And then if you want, maybe we can pursue it from there." And she asked what my price point was, or maybe she asked what my price point was first. And you know, I told her at the time it was a 12 by 16 painting of mine. I had sold in Chicago earlier that year for $600. So I said, "Oh, $600. She said, "Oh, that's about half of what the lowest figure painting that size on the strip costs." And so I think she said, "So maybe we'll try you for a holiday sale for a small painting and see how that goes." I think that's what she said. And so I said, "Oh, okay, well, you know, I'll keep in touch." And I went back to the first gallery, and the owner was there and said, "Yeah, I really think we could do something with this. This would fit in well here. It's figurative. It's kind of abstract," which is like, because it was a sort of contemporary gallery. And he said, "So what's your price point?" And I said, $1,200.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
and he said, "Okay, well, that's on the low end, but I think we can make that work, sure." And so that's how I got into a gallery in Scottsdale. And that's how I kind of established my price point that year, which was interesting. So
Such a learning experience.
yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So in the matter of, you know, when I first started in 2009, my 12 by 16 paintings were 200. And then later that year, or maybe they were 300. Then maybe later that year, or the next year, I think, in 2010, on Chisel, they were 600. And then towards the end of 2010, when I moved to a gallery in Scottsdale, they became 1,200. And, you know, the quality was pretty similar. I was increasing steadily in skill, but I mean, it wasn't like I think that the skill set merited a 200% increase in price every 9 months. It just happened because that's sort of the way the art market works, and people assign value.
I think you started a little low, though.
Well,
yeah,
but I was starting in pop-up sort of like craft fair sort of galleries. So I mean, that's kind of what you end up doing. But you know, yeah, like you said, it's all learning experience, and it's great that I had those learning experiences and I had them early on enough. And you know, when I was painting at the Palette and Chisel, I was working all of Prima. So to me, selling a painting for $600 seemed great because it was a day's worth of
Yeah.
work for $600. And then, of course, going to the gallery, selling an olive prima painting for $1,200 was like heaven for me.
Yeah.
And still amazing. So, it's been a great learning experience, and that's sort of how it happened.
That's cool.
So I'm starting actually to get into a little bit more value modulation. You can see I'm actually starting to shift the value structure of what I see. I'm working with the model at this point now. I'm no longer just filling in dots, but I'm trying to advance the subtlety of the values just a little bit more from what it was. And this is, again, to that level that I would not have been able to do if I hadn't gone in there and evened out all the surface, smoothed out all the irregularities caused by the texture of the paper. But it's going to allow me to propel the drawing forward quite a bit more in terms of the transitions I'm able to make, the subtle amounts of information I'm going to make. And, again, we're talking about a female figure here. And as a result, all of the anatomy that we're seeing in her torso there is super, super subtle. There's, not a whole lot of strong angular changes in value or even the shape. And that's going to require that this drawing match that level of sensitivity if I'm going to capture what it is I'm seeing. And, I think that's a fact that's lost on a lot of students, and it's something we've talked about throughout this video too, how when something in front of them seems this subtle, the tendency is to simplify it or to leave it more simplified and not take it out to this level of subtlety. And, I think that's probably just mostly due to the development of the student's eye. It's the human brain tries to categorize things really well and make things understandable and digestible, which means a lot of simplification. And so when somebody who's untrained in seeing all these subtle value shifts sees something like this torso, the first thing we do is simplify it to almost a cylindrical shape. And depending on the level of sensitivity that you have built up or trained yourself with, will ultimately determine how much information you can begin to put in here. Because again, the information that we do put in here, it can't be really obvious information. It has to be information on the level of subtlety that matches the subtlety of the model. I mean, what do you think about that, Christine? Is your eye is being trained pretty well and developed pretty well, but it may not be at the level of professional artists, but it's certainly better than all the students that we have in. For the most part, that we see coming through the academy, at least in the early stages. So what do you think about as far as the ability to see that subtlety, and what's going on in your head as far as, are you even thinking about that, or are you just so concerned with all the other measurements and value shifts and everything that you have to be doing?
Well, I definitely try not to think about that too soon. And I noticed that being like a major common thing with most students that I've worked alongside. So, I mean, that's one thing that has helped me notice it later, I guess, because all of the things that you're thinking about before you get to those, before you're able to allow yourself to really notice those subtleties are building up to that. And all of those choices that you're making as far as value shifts and shapes and all of those things are making up those subtleties. And it's really just all, you're breaking it down further and further and further. And at this point, I'm starting to allow myself and push myself to take it to that next level, rather than just knowing that I can if I wanted to.
Right, right.
I mean, I think you kind of get to that point, like, okay, I did that. Can I take it to that next place? So, and it's fun to be able to allow yourself to look even further and be even more critical about all of those super subtle notes.
Yeah, and I think especially as students, we have to encourage ourselves to do that, and not just say that, oh yeah, I think I did, and I think it looks right, but understand that at this stage of our learning process, especially, just having it look right is just the beginning of the battle, and from there on, it's to see how far we can push it and see how far we can train ourselves. And even as you enter the world of being a professional artist, so to speak, that's still an admirable challenge to do. If we think that what we've done is perfect, then there's no changing, and there's no progression and no evolution. You have to embrace the fact that we're going to increase our skill level always. We're always going to get a little better, and we can always strive to push the sensitivity in our work to a whole nother level. Even if that's not your common working style. Even if we come out of this program and we're very loose painters at the end of it, it's still a good idea every once in a while to be working on something that's forcing you to observe more carefully and see deeper and understand better. Ultimately, that helps your looser alla prima, direct painting, as well. It just gives you finer tuned ability to see.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and something that I thought to myself when I started this program was it didn't matter if I came out wanting to continue to make incredibly tight, realistic paintings or drawings. That wasn't the point.
Right, right.
The point was I wanted to, and I want to, increase my technical skill level, my skill set. And I know that by doing that, I will be a better overall artist, regardless of what style per se I decide to go with. I mean, obviously, I'm more interested in realism, but do I want to make a drawing that's this technically specific and tight? Someone would use the word tight, whatever. I don't know yet. I know to a certain degree. But I do know that it'll only make my work just at a higher level to have this ability.
Yeah.
So
it's nice to have the choice later on down the road instead of being hindered by that technical ability. And different subjects I think demand at least a little bit different of handling. To read successfully or to marriage the idea of subject with style, and we don't want to have to be held back. And I think a lot of artists do tend to fall behind the shield of looseness as a way to avoid having to confront this this idea of trying to see further and be more delicate. And the response I get from a lot of artists, and even a lot of amateurs, believe it or not, in open studio all the time, I see a lot of people look at something that's this tight, and they always say, oh, well, I could do that if I wanted to, but I don't like to paint like that. I like to paint looser. But when I'm shown work that they've done that is, so to speak, tighter, it's nowhere on this level of sensitivity. And I think people, I think it's a self-preservation thing too. But a lot of this process we've talked about, it's confronting that inability and being comfortable with saying that it's okay if you don't have that ability yet, but your ultimate goal should be to strive as far as we can in obtaining all these skills. As you see me work in this area here on the breast, it's slowly coming into completion here. And the changes that I'm making each time, again, they're these super tiny changes. And up close, it seems that almost nothing's happening, especially as we see it, if we were to see it real time. Because remember, this is sped up quite a bit. So when I come up here and I make a little mark or a little veil, not much is happening. And the only way for me to assess that a change is actually taking place is for me to step back, because up close, a tiny little veil like this is not significantly noticeable. I can't see really what's happening up close on this scale. It's just too smooth and too fluid, and so that's why you're seeing my hand disappear, every couple of seconds here, and that's me stepping back. And actually, you can see a little bit of my shadow. That's my shadow on the board. As you know, there I just stepped back, I came forward. The shadow is a little bit from the overhead lights casting onto the board. And, this is critical if you're getting to this level of refinement. Some people think that you reach a certain stage and you don't have to back up as much, and so you can spend all this time at the board.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see students get anywhere near this stage, it does seem like they're glued to the board, and I almost never see them step back. Because they think stepping back is just for that beginning measuring sort of thing. But really, we have to get ourselves some distance from the drawing board. And kind of a way to see why this is important is, if you look in, say, a magazine or a book, or have a large photograph, or even if you can get close enough to a billboard and you see somebody's face, like usually when you go to malls and things like that, they've got people plastered on some advertisement somewhere. From a distance, you can see all those value changes, all those edge changes, and everything. And when you get up close to the point where you're standing right in front of it, it just looks like such a smooth and flawless transition from one value to the next that you can't even see where the decision was made to make those value jumps that the camera has decided on. And that's how it is when you're this close to your drawing. We're seeing this super zoomed in, super exploded view. On most screens, I'm guessing my hand is much larger than life size. And so we're looking at a very, very close, tight shot of this. And so as a result, from this close, you can barely see where the values are stepping off on the breast here as they slowly fall away. It just looks like this super smooth, fluid transition. And as I'm building it up, I'm sort of interlocking these transitions to be even tighter and smoother and cleaner. And each of these marks I make is just almost an insignificant looking mark. And as a viewer, we might see this and say, okay, well, what he just did, that was almost nothing. That seemed like a waste of time. Like right there, that barely, I saw maybe a little tiny mark there, but not much. These are little microscopic changes that up close look like nothing's happening. Now, obviously, if we take the shot here and slide the bar over from beginning to end, it'll look like this blossoming, unfolding drawing that's emerging out of seemingly nothing. But all these little changes are happening, and it's possible that we can see and identify them on our drawing and gain that level of sensitivity, not just when looking at the model, but when looking at our own drawing. But again, it's going to require us to step back, and especially in our sort of education days of drawing and painting. It takes years and years and years to develop the understanding and the sensitivity to know what our drawings are looking like up close and at a distance as well. And again, these subtle changes can rarely be seen up close until you've developed your eye and your understanding of this to a very, very high level. And so when you see painters who are doing their whole painting seated, and they're still capturing all these subtle changes and understanding how to make it look good from a distance, those are usually painters who started their career standing and all the time, and only later on in life began to start sitting for whatever reason.
Experience.
Yeah.
They've already done it.
Right.
For a long time, repeatedly, for
Yeah.
a really long time.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
It does just become a really challenging thing for me to convince students to step back. Everybody's got a reason.
Yeah, why do you think that is? Do you think they feel like they're wasting their time, or?
Yeah, I definitely think that can be part of it. They think their time might be better spent up here at the board making changes. But I guarantee you, if I were to film one of the students working on their board, there would be a lot more work happening on their board than my board. It's just that because they're not stepping back and allowing themselves that distance to see these subtle changes, they're going to overshoot the changes. And that's when you get a lot of the back and the forth and the back and the forth, and you start to compile so much incorrect information on your drawing that developing a network of correct choices and subtle choices like this becomes impossible. Um, and it's like anything else in here. It stacks and stacks and stacks. And so if you get yourself off on the wrong foot, it's really hard to recover and find your way back here to this subtle rendering. But I don't know. I get a lot of variety of excuses. That's one of them. Another is for whatever physical reason, people don't think they can step back a lot, or another one is people don't think they can see from more than 2 feet away from their board. And then another one, surprisingly, is that people convince me or try to convince me that they are stepping back.
Mm-hmm.
I had a whole group of painters for a while who would swear that they were stepping back all the time. Oh, I step back. I'm stepping back all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I see the video playback of me painting along with them, and they're glued to their board for 15 or 20 minutes at a
Mm-hmm.
time.
Well, that's not to cut you off, but that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
They're glued to their board for 15 to 20 minutes. How often would you say that they should be stepping away?
Well, it does depend on what stage of the drawing you're at, but
Sure.
at this stage of the drawing, I'd say every 10 to 15 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah. And one of the things, I think we might have mentioned it in the plaster cast, the lips, was that I tried to tell people early on at the very beginning of the program that, try to imagine there's like poison gas at your board. That you can't spend more than 10 to 15 seconds holding your breath at your board, make your changes that you decided on, of course, from a distance, not from up close, and then make those changes and step back and take a breath of fresh air and see how it looks. I don't know. It's hard to figure out a way to trick students into stepping back a lot because, again, we get lost in so many different things. We're lost in the measuring. We're trying to observe. We're trying to remember to squint. We're trying to remember to do all this sort of stuff. It's just hard to remember to step back. For me, I think it's easy because I naturally have a little more energy. I like to be moving around. I think it's because I spend so much time in an office. I hate sitting down. It's really hard for me to sit down, and I have to force myself to make a deliberate decision if I need to sit down and like fill in dots, for example. But I like to be moving back and forth, so it was never that hard for me. But for a lot of students who aren't used to this yet, or they're not understanding the physical demands that can come along with this, they just don't as much. In painting, it becomes easier. In painting, we can just take somebody's palette and set it back 5 or 10 feet and force them to go back there to pick up more paint and then go to their easel. And that actually is something that I did do in Chicago for a while, just to make sure that I was stepping back enough. Because, again, like I mentioned, we always have this perception of what we're actually doing, or we think we know what we're actually doing. But it's really hard to be objective and to step back and actually see ourselves in action. I've suggested people film themselves, but it's not always a viable option.
Well, I think part of it, too, could be that so they get sucked in, they work really hard on this little spot, what they consider, working hard, and it's like you almost don't want to know.
Right, yeah,
what you did
absolutely.
Wrong.
Yeah, no, that's for sure.
Because that's when it really is clear when you step back, and if you're not
yeah.
doing it enough, then honestly, it's kind of a scary thing.
It is, yeah.
Because in the past, you might not have done enough, and then when you did, all you've seen are your mistakes.
Right.
But that's what you want,
exactly.
is to see
Yeah.
your mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. It points out the inaccuracies in the drawing, and that's tough because up close they don't look inaccurate. And I think that's a battle that we've all had at some point,
Definitely.
one or another. I certainly
Sure.
had it, and you argue with yourself and with other
Sure.
people. Well, it looks good from up close. I'm not going to cater to how it looks from a distance because it looks good up close. That was like my number one reasoning, and I would say, well, I want people to be looking at my paintings from 2 feet away. Because they're small, delicate paintings, and so that I want them to look good from up close before they look good from a distance. And it's just backwards thinking, and it's hard to make forward momentum on our work that way. in some really subtle little veils now. Notice I'm just holding my pencil from the back, and it's because the stuff I'm putting in is just so light at this point. I did go back and crisp up that one far side or far arm, made that a little sharper, starting to think about edge quality a little bit more too. Remember, I am intending on this torso being, for the most part, done before I move on. Now I can tell you what ultimately happens is, even though I'm satisfied with the value distribution here at this stage and satisfied with a lot of the edge quality as well, ultimately the level of refinement on the arm and hand and the leg ends up being such a smoother, finer level of finish that I end up revisiting the torso just a little bit because I want that torso to match the smoother level of finishes. I think that's something we talked about with portrait in the portrait video, is that you're using that first area as a key, but then in your next area you're able to develop a higher level of finish. You wouldn't want to sacrifice that higher level of finish because you didn't get there in your first shape. You just revisit, touch up that first shape a little bit, which is what I'll do, and try to bring everything to that nice clean finish. But again, it's super subtle stuff. There's no real secret here, and a lot of people think that there's a lot of magic at this stage too. But it's actually a lot of squinting actually. You think you might just need to squint to see those initial relationships of light and dark, but squinting just a little bit here now will point out they'll exaggerate to a small degree all those little value jumps, which is nice because the little value jumps are hard to see when our eyes are open. Our eyes are taking in so much information, but when we squint, we can see all those little value jumps and see them exaggerated. And if some pop out too much and look over-exaggerated too much, then we can go back and revisit them and knock them down a little bit and make that transition a little more smooth. So squinting, both squinting and stepping back are really, really instrumental at this stage, more than you might think. It's not just for seeing simple, basic relationships. It's going to really help you for these finer tuned, more subtle relationships. And notice here too, I am bouncing around a little bit. I put an accent around the occlusion under the breast. I'm heading up to the neck and actually laying in a little bit of surrounding information. I'm just actually setting up the drawing now for me to move forward for the rest of it, and just checking my last final relationships here in the torso.